I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making some other poor, dumb bastard die for his country. After reading some, let's say, foreign-sounding texts, pieces from Aquinas and Augustine and Luther last week, here we get to ideas that resonate with that sentiment, misattributed to George Patton, who had a fondness both for denigrating his enemies and using the word bastard very profligately in his speeches. That line itself is not one of his, but is in the movie Patton, and gets to, I think, some of the misconceptions that we encounter when we talk about the idea of war ever being noble, war ever being something that is fought honorably, and that the lie of that was more than at any other point in time made a lie in the 20th century. So this week we're reading excerpts from writers from the 20th century that understand that type of war far better than Augustine, Aquinas, or Luther did. Even though we associate a state of sort of constant warfare and maybe even barbarity with pre-modern times, it's uncontroversial to say that the 20th century was the time when more people died in conflicts than at any other point in human history. So really, the pieces that you're going to be reading this week and that I'm going to try to introduce to you now are the ones that are most salient, that have come face to face with the horrors of war, far more so than the barbarous people of the past, whether that be the Middle Ages or classical times, ever did. The type of savagery associated with conflict in the 20th century just defies description. Now, what I'd like to do to introduce these texts is not go through each point by point, because there are ideas that are very specific and I think don't require a lot of clarification in the texts themselves, in the excerpts. But there's some ideas about how we think about war that are common and make the background of the thinking of these people. One of the things that I want you to understand when you're reading through these pieces is that there's a type of interrelationship, what constitutes a war, especially when we talk about the idea of a just war being one of aggression or defense. You'll encounter liberation as an idea this week, and that discussion is very often referencing nuclear weapons. Now, this happens in the 20th century and changes how we need to think about conflict, because the development of nuclear weapons is happening actually at the same period of time that more than ever humanity is understood in a global sense. It's not until we get to the writings of Marshall McLuhan that we understand the idea of a global village. It's in 1948 only that we get the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which are rights given or ascribed to all people, not just people of a certain language group or people from a certain continent, people with a certain skin color, but everyone, all of humanity possesses these rights. And so that means that in any conflict, the rights of any person are being infringed upon in the same way, to the same extent. So specifically, that UN Declaration happens in 1948. It's first promulgated then, which is the same year that the United States completed a series of nuclear tests, Project Sandstone, that doubled the capacity or the effective load of nuclear weapons. So you had explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki of about 20 kilotons, and that doubles in the explosions of Project Sandstone that happened out in the Eniwetok atolls. So the first series of tests that you may have seen on sort of grainy black and white videos were in the Bikini Atoll, and ships were blown up to see the effect of nuclear weapons on ships, so over water. Then after that, Inuiatok, we then, just a year after that, so in 1949, the Soviet Union detonates their first nuclear weapon, and then the entire second half of the 20th century constitutes an arm race in which the two sides of the Cold War, so the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc, and NATO powers, but predominantly the United States, build up arsenals and enter into a series of proxy wars with each other, with the threat of what we now call mutually assured destruction looming over top of everyone. So after the initial conflicts after the first conflicts of the 20th century, we have a new experience after World War I of what it means to be entered into a world war that is also a total war. So in a total war, industrialized societies actually bend their entire will, their entire means of production, all of their citizenry into the act of fighting wars. So rather than having a professional standing army that's funded by the government that then exercises the, let's say, international agenda of a government, as we find throughout the 19th century, you have well-funded kings, queens, emperors, what have you, entering into military conflicts with other nations, but with the general populace, for the most part, left out of the popular war effort. Something changes in the 20th century that implicates whole countries into conflicts. That industrial scale of conflict becomes not only something that chews up more people, that consumes more resources, but through the progression of the development of weapons in the 20th century, multiplies the destructive power of armies greatly. So the paradigmatic case in World War I is obviously the invention of machine guns. So the force multiplier found in a machine gun changes just how many casualties there are in war. This leads to a whole bunch of changes. This leads to trench warfare and the creation of a type of war of attrition, because the force multipliers that can be brought to bear by either side in a conflict changes how people fight. In between the periods of World War I and World War II, the development of air power then creates a way for armed forces to extend their destructive capabilities far beyond the front lines. It's not merely how far you can lob a shell, but now how far can a plane fly? Then obviously the development of further ways to extend and multiply force, like guided missiles, like eventually nuclear weapons, changes again how we think about war and where it can be and how quickly it can escalate. All of this means that when we talk about war today, we are fundamentally talking about a different type of activity or a different set of potentialities than we ever get in the biblical record, than we ever get in the writings that we considered last week. So really, what you're reading today is going to be a new type of reckoning with what it means to fight. And also, because we're dealing with this new reckoning with how we fight, it's important to remember, going through all of this, that the type of universalization of human rights, of the understanding of what we as a world are, changes concurrently. So at the very time that the stakes are being raised in terms of what violence can do, how quickly destruction can be meted out on a group of people, you have a recognition that people across the world are just like you and me, at least in terms of the rights and security that are due to them. So the idea that a carpet bombing run in Cambodia in the Vietnam War actually is as if carpet bombs were being dropped in Kansas, in Ontario, wherever it might be. That changes how we're thinking about war. So The other thing that's going to happen as you're considering the text this week is that you are going to really, I believe for the first time, see just how many of the ideas that we've already seen interconnect. So right off the bat, when you're reading through Welty, the first of the texts considering just war doctrines, you'll see points like in 17-13 or 17.13, an echoing of the passage we read a couple of weeks ago from Niebuhr, which asked people to consider that there are actually two standards of morality, that we have to deal with the way personal, individual, private moral lives work, and also how public, state-level morality is governed. That type of connection is going to become apparent here in these. And so watch for that. You're going to see a piece from Hauerwas again. So now, with perhaps you feeling a little bit down about just how terrible war is, I'd first of all say, good. War is a terrible evil, and so we're going to talk about it. To talk about war in this context, in our modern context, it's important to define some terms, especially, I think it was Lawrence Hale, if you've been seeing the questions coming in from the Ask Me Anything, who said, how does the questions of war and peace, or the application of force in between nations in war, affect law enforcement? So domestic sort of use of violence. This I want to use as a starting off point to just say, when we talk about war right now in these excerpts, are still speaking about conflicts in between sovereign entities. And so that means we have different types of state actions. So the government of the United States, which has a certain degree of control over a defined set of borders, enters into a war when it engages in a conflict with another separate sovereign territory. So things like extraterritorial military actions to fight terrorism or to combat piracy in the open seas are not forms of war. They are obviously examples of violence, often state-sanctioned violence, but they don't meet the criteria of something that would be considered fully a war. So there needs to be, for a war, two separate sovereign territories that engage in some type of conflict. Obviously, right away, you're probably thinking, but what about cases like failed states? So as an example, the conflict in Libya around especially after the death of Muammar Gaddafi, and the territories that were sort of occupied by splinter sections of what we would probably consider to be terrorist groups. Similarly, the conflict combating ISIS, which is still ongoing if you're following the news. The last few cities in Syria under the control of ISIS are about to fall. That's a strange example and an exception to typical ideas of war as a type of statecraft, because there you have an organization that might want to declare itself to be a state, not really having any legitimacy on a world stage. So that type of military action is in fact not a war. And that's important because a lot of what we're reading this week assumes that the conflict is going to be engaged by two parties that at least have similar legal standing. Similarly, some of the conflicts underway currently in Afghanistan fail to fully meet the idea of war as such, because the Taliban in Afghanistan is not quite a state, but has levels of state-like capabilities because they control chunks of territory, although that's within a separate sovereign entity. So you have Afghanistan as a whole, and then the areas that are controlled by the Taliban. And that's more difficult to apply these types of arguments to because, well, as I said, war typically is defined as a conflict in between two sovereign entities. So don't get me wrong, it's difficult to pin down just what we're talking about. But for the purposes of these texts, when you read war, when you read conflict, assume that it's in between two separate states. And so if we're fighting between states, the question then is, what are we fighting for? That should be obvious, because we fight to win. Like I said, it's Patton who says that you win a war not by dying for your country, but by making someone else die for their country. But there are in fact different visions of what victory looks like. These are sometimes desirable distinctions, and sometimes they're unfortunate realities. So when we talk about conflict, I'm going to offer, well, these are not my distinctions, within sort of types of military doctrine, you can assume that a victory is what we're chasing. You go to war because you want to win, and probably you go to war because you expect at least the possibility of a win. Otherwise, you capitulate right away because there's no strategic value. There's no value in just throwing yourself against the bayonets of your enemies. But there are different ways that you can win or expect to win. Obviously, what everyone hopes for is a strategic victory or a total victory. If you enter into a war, you want to win. And I think if we were to give an example of this, very, very sort of concrete, definite, we would look at the first Iraq War, so Operation Desert Storm, where Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States came to the defense of Kuwait, and in doing so, achieved a total strategic victory. Iraq said, no, we're done. We have been overwhelmed by the armed forces of the United States. You win. And the conflict stopped completely. The existence of a second Iraq War is a separate issue, but we do know that it's possible to win a war. And then once that war is won, there's no more fighting, at least not in any type of continuous way. Sometimes, though, the best thing that can be hoped for is a decisive victory. So this is just a step along the way. Think about in World War II, if you want to consider World War II as such, there was a decisive victory in the Battle of Stalingrad. So this was the conflict or the siege of Stalingrad by the Nazis, who were attempting to overtake the city, which was under Soviet control. So in Pavlov's house, you have a case of the defenders actually gaining a decisive victory. So the German forces came up to a large apartment building, which was occupied by Soviet forces. They attempted, they attempted to take over this compound. After the attack, which was a siege that lasted something like 40 days, the Soviet defenders were capable of holding off the assault, were relieved, and then in fact the tides turned. So rather than this being a conflict still going on, the Soviets pushed back, and so they moved on to the next step of the conflict. Decisive victories are pieces of the puzzle on the way to what is either a strategic victory, so the total end of all conflict, or sometimes what we end up with is something called a Pyrrhic victory. So this is a conflict that may lead to a victory on the part of one of the combatants, but the costs associated are so terrible that it actually would have been perhaps better if they'd never fought at all. Interestingly enough, this is actually one of the types of conflicts that made Canada what it is. So by that, I'm specifically referring to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. This was during the, sometimes called the Battle of Quebec. So this was during the 7 Years' War. This was in 1759. And in that battle, which is famously commemorated in the scene of the death of General Wolfe, so you've probably seen that this painting, it's on display at the National Gallery, where you have the commander of the British forces sort of swooning after being shot with his coterie of attendants all around him as he dies in the field. Now, this is oftentimes referred to as the decisive moment when the British defeated the French. But that day, in that conflict itself, the French won. They repelled the assault on Quebec City. But the costs were so great that after their victory, they evacuated the city, and their forces were so depleted that they eventually capitulated. So this was a case of winning the day or winning the battle, but losing the war. This type of conflict is perhaps obvious. You might hear that and think, that sounds terrible. Why would you ever desire that? Well, consider, for instance, in one of the texts, specifically when you get to 1914, there's a recognition by the Catholic bishops that, and I quote, there's a recognition that at times a defense of key values, even against great odds, may be a proportionate witness, end quote. So there seems to be a suggestion that one of the ways that a war can perhaps be just or desirable is actually to serve as a witness. And so fighting and losing, but losing in defense of key values, could itself be an agreeable or perhaps a desirable trait. And this finds echoes in a saying that's attributed to Tertullian, an early father of the church, who is well known for saying that the blood of martyrs, so get this, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So you have this idea that by people dying on behalf of their faith, the church grew at a speed that is without compare throughout the history of Christianity. During the times of greatest persecution, conversely, the witness of those who died for a cause then led to the Christian explosion throughout Asia Minor. If we extend something like that to the idea of a conflict, we could perhaps see a way that wars or conflicts can be fought on behalf of ideals, even in the face of overwhelming odds, simply for the sake of a Christian witness. This is admittedly a very strange idea. But it's not the only strange idea that you'll see in the texts. When we turn to Hauerwas, we'll get some of the same types of ideas that we encountered in his text that we read in the very first week, where he makes the claim that there is no real Christian ethic that is possible apart from Christian practice. So again, there is no way that we can make abstract claims about the way the world ought to work without grounding that in specific Christian practice. And so, in this piece from Hauerwas, we get the idea that pacifism as an idea cannot be justified solely on philosophical grounds. There's no way to create an argument that is purely rational as to why fighting is never okay. But for Hauerwas, it's actually a case of the love that we have as Christians and the way that we are formed through Christian practice that causes us to become the types of things that are pacifists. So it's not that pacifism itself is an end goal and we need to connect the dots along the way to get there because Jesus tells me so, but actually that as we learn a type of radical love, both for our friends and our enemies, we see in conflicts, both in the aggressors and those transgressed upon, the face of Christ. This is the radical difficulty and extremely high call of a Hauerwasian style pacifism. That as there are people, as there are bad men, as there are warmongers fighting and killing and attacking the face of Christ is just as much in the face of the man holding the gun as the man or woman lying prostrate saying, "Don't shoot." This is a hard saying. And when you think about these hard truths of who has what moral standing in a conflict and what types of actions we should undertake, the most useful, in my opinion, text of all of these is the one that you'll be reading from Oliver O'Donovan. So this is extract 22, and what it does is put the onus on both the attacker and the defender to discriminate. And so he parses the idea of discrimination as a type of value judgment, particularly how battles ought to be fought. It addresses issues like hostage tactics in a fascinating way that I'd say you should all write your reflections on this. But the problem is his ideas have almost no comparison in between, at least in relation to the writings of Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther. Because what he is able to do is highlight how wars are fought in and around civilians. So not only how hostage shield tactics work, but how when you intend to attack a target, even if you presume something like just war theory is a viable way to wage conflict in between states, there is a duty incumbent upon both the aggressor and even the defender to determine how, when, and where force is to be used. The combat is obviously in between combatants. And if you can't, with reasonable certainty, say that you have both tried to protect non-combatants on your side and not attacked the enemy in a way that needlessly injures or puts at risk non-combatants, then you are doing this whole war thing wrong. It's a fascinating piece. Read it. Again, I say, there are some pieces, read once, read twice. This, you could almost commit to memory because it's a fantastic heuristic for understanding what it means to take seriously fighting in and around those who are not fighting. And so this makes nations or states responsible for their own non-combatants and complicit with any of their own losses. So it's not simply that it falls to the enemy to make sure that they are not sort of creating collateral damage, that they are not unjustly targeting civilians, but that your side also needs to be at pains to build military installations outside of civilian areas. It's a fascinating piece. I could not do it justice just parsing it right now without reading directly from the text. Read that. Now, if we're fighting and we need to be concerned, I am not a member of the armed forces. If states are fighting and states are desiring victory and they are doing so in a responsible way, which ensures that there is a minimization and in fact extensive efforts to prevent any damage or harm to both civilian infrastructure and civilians, sometimes this could lead to strange forms of victory. I said that people always are looking for strategic victory. Decisive victories are steps along the way. Pyrrhic victories are types of conflicts where the victory actually probably costs the victor more than it should, or even more than the losing side could come out ahead. There's also a separate category that is referred to as a tactical victory. You know how life is sometimes about when life gives you lemons, make lemonade out of it. This can sometimes be like the opposite, where you expect to win or you hope for win, you're pursuing a particular goal and you fail to achieve that goal. But in that failure, you actually, on the other side, experience some other benefit. So if you think that a Pyrrhic victory is one where the winner actually gets something less, they come out behind. A tactical victory often is one where the loser comes out ahead. So you didn't achieve your objectives, but something else happened along the way. Why talk about these different types of victory? Because I believe that the texts themselves are so diverse, the way that they engage conflict creates and should create for you a type of tension that makes convincing cases sometimes for why fighting is necessary. But then the question is not only made more complicated in the sense of what is victory, but also why should we fight in the first place. And sometimes, again, as mentioned, it could be that we fight to lose. But in losing, we support a noble cause. We support key values. And something like this, to actually maybe break my own rules and conflate this with an example pulled from a domestic action, so not a state-to-state type of conflict, but domestically, I can think of no better example of that Pyrrhic victory than the photos taken of student protests in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, where we see students standing in front of tanks, students that we know moments later were shot. So the People's Republic Army of China then opened fire on these student protesters, but the images of that themselves became a sort of secular version of Tertullian's aphorism. So the blood of those protesters became the seed of reform in communist China. That's an example of sort of how this Pyrrhic victory can then lead to greater hopes. Sorry, I misspoke. That would actually be a type of tactical victory in domestic affairs, where what seems like a loss actually became eventually a win. Now, there are a lot of other ideas throughout these texts that become, I think, overwhelming to try to introduce all of them. For example, there's casual mention in Welty 1717 that sounds a lot like what we now come to understand as shock and awe principles. So you enter into a conflict hoping to do the least amount of damage possible. And so one of the ways that that's been interpreted by military theorists is that what we ought to do is sort of go in guns a-blazing, do as much, we want to convince the enemy of our capabilities, and in doing so, limit the amount of actual conflict. And then at other times, in the piece that we get from the author from South Africa, Ackerman, speaking about the recognition of other that happens in conflicts. This is a crucial factor in conflicts that span not only national divides, but cultural ones. There are ways that conflict, I think, is especially portrayed as some type of noble action in between groups that are similar culturally. So the way that the old canard gets trotted out in the history of World War I, that on Christmas Day, the two sides emerged from the trenches and came to the middle and played soccer and sang carols together. And then the next day they started fighting. That type of recognition of the humanity of the other side is possible when you have officer corps that in the one hand from England and France that would have traveled to Germany and vice versa, and you get a recognition of the humanity of the people on the other side. Conversely, the types of moral boogeyman cases that we encounter in accounts of World War II, especially in the Pacific Theater, often highlight the barbarity of the Japanese fighting the more human, reserved, noble white Americans. And we know that this is something that is factually incorrect, that there are in fact atrocities on both sides. And this extends not only through the war, but after. So you have the horrors of Japanese internment camps, notably Camp 371, where there were live vivisection performed by Japanese medical officers. And yet after the fact, the United States military officials granted immunity to all of these people in order to get their information on biological warfare, on vivisection, and things as horrible as chemical agents and venereal diseases. I mean, there is no side that is clear and noble in that situation, but the type of demonization experienced or put upon Japanese soldiers is a refusal to recognize the other because the other is so strange. And Ackerman's point that her country is both such a recent survivor of conflict and is so multicultural is an excellent way of understanding how the dehumanization process happens in conflict. So, in the same way that I have been answering some questions in the section of the first readings, I will also be more available and commenting on your feedback and discussion for this week once that becomes available on Friday. So think of these texts now. If there are things that you encounter that seem strange, I'm happy to discuss more of this. It may perhaps seem obvious that I have earlier on in my academic studies, I'd studied far more, not only non-conventional warfare, but also military history. That was a big part of my undergraduate degree. And so a lot of the ways that these geopolitical concepts then affect how we consider theological ethics is something I'm happy to explain with a little more nuance in written format. Because again, there are so many cases from throughout the 20th century that just making one video that would explain all of these would go on forever. So if you have specific questions, feel free to bring those up in the comment section on Friday. If you want an answer tonight, send me an email. And I'm happy to discuss or provide examples of other resources to get behind some of these ideas. I hope you enjoy the texts. I think that they are all readable this week and that they all will hit you, I think, in a visceral way. You'll probably read through one and think, aha, yeah, this is when it's okay to fight. You'll read through another one and say, oh, I should just throw myself in front of a weapon. And the next text will then remind you, no, I should actually simply dedicate my life to prayer and the prevention of conflict and let other people in our societies deal with the conflict. You should feel yourself being pulled in a lot of different ways as you read each of these authors. They are excellent examples. I know that in some past weeks, there have been examples that Gil gives of poor arguments, but necessary ones to show a given case. So this is not the case. All of these pieces are top rate. And so because of that, it will be difficult to adjudicate where you stand in relation to these ideas. But as you work that out for yourself, you are in fact becoming a more coherent thinker and able to offer opinions on why conflict is perhaps necessary, or if it ever is, and if Christians can themselves participate. That is going to be churning within you this week. So best of luck, and let me know whatever questions you have, and I look forward to being in further dialogue in the discussion forums about a lot of these ideas. Take care. Have a great day.